The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
I want to introduce Dr. Wenling Chow from the Department of History here at MTSU. She is also the director of the undergraduate program in the history department. And her expertise lies in the history of China, of course, which I'm sure you could guess, but in particular, the history of medicine in China. So she also teaches courses on history of medicine here in the department, as well as history of Japan. And so we're very lucky to have her joining us here today to talk to you about China, traditions, and modernity, as well as Confucianism. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Chow.
Thank you, Stacy. Okay, good morning, all of you, and thank you for coming. I thought about, what I should talk about, today, since, China, history of China is such a, big topic. We have such a long history. So I thought, I would, focus on Confucius and Confucianism, and tie, some of his ideas, to what happened through history and to modernity, as well. And what I would do, is I've got handouts of primary documents. I'm going to hand out these readings and have, I guess, 4 different groups. I have 4 different sections in here. And each group would only read that little section because we don't have a lot of time to go over everything. But certainly these would be available for you later on if you want to read that. And then I've got questions for one short question for each group, sort of what you should be looking for as you're reading. Okay, so the first one. The first selection is from, the Analects, and then the second one with number 2 is Chen Du Shou, The Way of Confucius in Modern Life, and then 3, Madam Cheng on the New Life Movement, and then number 4 is Gu Mu, Confucianism as the Essence of Chinese Tradition. Okay. So could I ask these 2 rows to read the first section, and then just go over the 4 sections on gentleman, humanity, and not the last section which says Mencius, and then would this section do number 2? Which is Chen Du Shou's The Way of Confucius in Modern Life. So basically, what did he see as the problem of Confucianism in China at the time? Okay. And then would these 2 rows do read number 3, Madam Chiang Kai-shek on the New Life Movement? And then, what were they trying to achieve with the New Life Movement, and what were some of the behavior codes? And then Gu Mu, the last 2 rows, Gu Mu, Confucianism, as the essence of Chinese tradition. Okay, so we'll spend a few minutes on that first, and then we'll go into, the lecture. Okay, so if everybody pretty much done? So I picked Confucius also because, if you talk to students, what do you know about China? What comes to mind when you say China? Very often, students might say Confucius, fortune cookies, saying, Confucius, although that's not quite true, but Confucius has really come to represent, the Chinese culture. But what, when people say Confucius or Confucianism, what comes to your mind? What do you think of if people say Confucius?
A philosopher. A philosopher.
A philosopher? Mm-hmm.
Beliefs.
Usually the different sayings attributed to him.
Sorry?
The different sayings attributed to him.
Okay, different sayings. What kinds of sayings?
Just, stuff that people say Confucius says, and a lot of times they're misquoting by not
Okay,
actually.
so he's kind of a sage. He knows everything. He's a teacher. Now, if we go back to the historical period and look at who Confucius was, he emerges as someone somewhat different. The closest historical source, a biography written during the Han Dynasty, the next dynasty, starts out as portraying him as a kind of cantankerous old man. He's not a very lovable person, somewhat like Socrates, who liked to argue, was lacking in social skills, and he was a very driven man, a very ambitious man, and he was frustrated in his lifetime. So, the political and social situation in which Confucius lived was a period of political turmoil, political fragmentation. You've heard about the spring and the autumn and warring states period, where you have all these different states competing with one another, and the breakdown of the social order, that had really guided people's behaviors, in the previous, period. So, he was living during this particularly fraught time, and he was dissatisfied with what he saw. And so what he wanted to do was to restore the order of the previous golden age. And like many other philosophers, he went around, trying to persuade these lords to employ him, to try to persuade them that his way was the best way. But unfortunately, he did not succeed. He went around, there were records, of him actually serving as ministers, a minister in, one of the small states. But he really was not very successful in that he was unyielding, in his ideas, and he was also rather abrasive, in insisting, that the lords listen to him, and do everything, his way. So he was not successful in his efforts to become, a minister, to bring about change, within the world, and to restore, the golden age. So he died really of frustration, and he died in relative obscurity. Not very many people knew about him. Certainly there were his critics, who, criticized him for being, impractical, and such. But he died in obscurity. So how did he then become, such a, tremendous symbolic figure for Chinese culture? And for this, we have to look at what happened after his death, and some of his teachings, as well. Confucius, like Socrates, did not write down anything. So a lot of his teachings comes down to us through the writings of his disciples. Just as Socrates, we know a lot of his ideas, through Plato, and his students. And so one of the main sources of his ideas is from the Analects, which is a collection of the conversation between Confucius and his disciples. So you see that, the Confucius, sayings a lot of times are extracted, from the Analects. And then, later on, we'll see how, he evolved into such a, cultural icon and the so-called uncrowned king, of Chinese civilization. And Confucius, again, we have to keep in mind that did not invent these ideas. What he did, was to really systematize, and also, bring together, the changes that were already occurring within society, at the time. So if we take a look at the Analects, and I'm going to ask this group that had, the first section on looking at sayings from the Analects. Under the section, the gentleman, what struck you as, the sort of the most representative of his ideas of what the gentleman was?
I think the quote where he said, "If the gentleman is not dignified, he will not command respect, and his teachings will not be considered solid." Not only for a group of teachers is that kind of an important quote, but he himself was a teacher. And so if you don't command the respect, if you don't treat people right, they're not going to listen to you, and what you believe is not going to be shared.
And so he's saying that, a gentleman, who would, in his assumption, would be the leader, of all the others, has to conduct himself and note that it's himself. He talks about men. That, they had to be decorous, they have to follow the rituals, and they have to, have morality and be clear, in his teachings, as well. And the gentleman, the idea of the gentleman comes from, a very ancient period of time where, the aristocrats were considered gentlemen. But in a period of turmoil, the meaning of gentleman changed, where Confucius argues that a gentleman is made and not born. So it's not because of your birth, but it's because of your education, how you conduct yourself, your morality, the rites that you perform, that is important. So he says, the gentleman understands integrity. The petty person knows about profit. And one of the emphasis, in terms of, the idea of the gentleman is that he disdains making profits, he disdains, the selfish ways, and, instead, he looks out, for the common good and sets himself up as the model for, the rest of the people. What about humanity? What does he say about humanity that strikes you?
Well, he says that people can be classified according to their faults, and that you can know a person by observing the individual's faults. You can know if they're a person of humanity or not. So he's looking at actions. What you do is important,
and what's within your heart is important, as well. So it's the humanity. It's how you treat others, and he says that, when you go out, treat everyone as if you were welcoming a great guest. Employ people as if you were conducting a great sacrifice. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Then neither in your country nor in your family will there be complaints against you. So, this, humanity towards others, he sees, as an important aspect, for a leader, and for a gentleman. So the man of humanity is cautious in his speech, and he then will be able to accomplish, great things. And humanity, he says, is more important for people than water or fire. And he says that riches and honors are the things people desire, but if one obtains them by not following the way, then one would not be able to hold them. Poverty and low position in society are things that people hate, but if one can avoid them only by not following the way, then one should not avoid them. Okay, so following the way, having that humanity, was important. Okay. Filial piety. I always ask my students, what's filial piety? And they were like, what? And that is a very important concept for Confucius.
This is one of our standards for 6th grade, is teaching about filial piety. And so the honoring your father even after his death and what his wishes would be.
So honoring your parents while they're alive, and continuing to honor them, even after they're dead. When your parents are alive, serve them according to the rules of ritual and decorum. When they are deceased, give them a funeral and offer sacrifices to them according to the rules and rituals and decorum. So, the normal requirement for observance of mourning rituals for a parent is 3 years. And for a teacher, it's 3 years as well. So Confucius, for example, his disciples observed the standard, his close disciples observed the 3 years of mourning, for him. But, parents are fallible, parents are human. So what do you do when a parent is unreasonable and a parent says something that's wrong? What, according to Confucius, what should you do?
Well, you talk to them tactfully and don't offend them. And if they continue to not follow your advice, you're still reverent to them. And you don't talk about them. You don't murmur against them.
Yeah.
So you keep trying to lead them the right way, but if they don't go, you're still reverent to them.
So you do not confront your parents, and I think that was the main thing. You continue to show them respect. You remonstrate with them, hoping that they will listen. But if they do not, you cannot, argue with them, scold them, or anything. So that's, filial piety, absolute reverence and respect for your parents. And this, applies to teachers, as well. And the last section, I think it's telling. The Duke of Shi said to Confucius, in my land there is an upright man. His father stole a sheep, and the man turned him into the authorities. So, that's according to the law, right? Confucius replied, the upright men of my land are different. The father will shelter the son, and the son will shelter the father. Righteousness lies precisely in this. So for him, family ties comes first. A son should shelter the father even though he may have broken the law. Now this is going to change later on when Confucianism becomes state ideology. And obedience to laws becomes more important. But here you can see Confucius's emphasis on the family, and this ties into the emphasis on ancestor worship, the family unit, in traditional China, both in the Shang and the Zhou dynasties. And so, that emphasis on family, that emphasis on respect, on filial piety, is one of the core teachings of Confucianism. Governing, what sorts of ways should the ruler govern?
Lead them by means of government policies and regulate them through punishment.
Well, he talks about setting up governance as the ruler as a model, serving as a model for the people. And remember, at this time, there were all different philosophers, with competing ideas, trying to persuade the rulers to adopt, their particular policies. So there were legalists, who says that obedience to laws, was the most important. There were the Taoists who says, no, just follow the natural way of things. And Confucius was very much against the laws. You can see from, that story about the son that, law was not, obedience to the law was not, of his paramount, concern. And so the way to govern was really to, first of all, set yourself up as, the North Star, to attract others, to you, be the gentleman so that people will follow your example, your moral example. But also you should promote the upright. So your selection of officials is very important, who you put in place as your ministers. For Confucius then, that righteousness is the most important. When there was this duke who asked him, inquiring about governing, the master said, make food supply sufficient, provide an adequate army, and give people reason to have faith. And then, this disciple asked, if one had no choice but to dispense with one of these three, which should it be? Eliminate the army. If one had no choice but to get rid of one of the two remaining, which should it be? Dispense with food. And Confucius said, since ancient times, death has always occurred, but people without faith cannot stand. So for him, that's the most important. You get rid of the army, you get rid of the food, but righteousness, that morality, cannot be dispensed with. So overall, how would you describe Confucius's vision, of, an ideal state?
I think that was interesting on the very first of that one on governing. When he talks about, he says, okay, well, if you do it by this way, if you lead them by means of government policies and regulate them through punishments, people become evasive and they have no sense of shame. So, go ahead, set them up like this in this really strict form, and they'll just learn to go around it, and they won't feel guilt or anything. They'll just feel like they've gotten the right end of the bargain. But if you lead them with your own virtue, set yourself up as an example, and then give them rituals in a way that everything works, if they do something wrong, they'll have a sense of shame, and they'll have their own standards. I thought that was kind of interesting, because you get students who, if you just set yourself up as this uncaring, firm, they think getting around you is pretty cool, because then they've one-upped you. But if you set them up as knowing them and knowing who they are, then when you can talk to them, then they've actually let you down and they feel bad about it, and they have a sense of their own worth, and they have their own, how they kind of fit into the classroom.
And so Confucius was against the laws because, precisely that. It does not instill that sense of morality and shame, in people. If you think that you can get away with something, you do that. But if you instill a sense of shame, in people, a sense of right and wrong and moral values, they would not do it even if the opportunity presented itself. So he knows that this is going to take a much longer time than laws, because laws is very efficient. You do this, you get punished, you get beaten up, 30 strokes. But if there's a sense of shame, they won't even do it. So, for Confucius then, it's the creation of this moral state based on, family values, based on the importance, of filial piety, humanity, and should be led by gentlemen. So it's a very idealistic, society. But you can imagine that the rulers didn't really find that all that exciting or useful. What do you mean I have to be good and moral? And so he was not, very successful. And, as I mentioned, he died in relative obscurity. But through his disciples who expanded on his teachings, and later on the subsequent dynasty, the Han Dynasty, the Qin Dynasty came first, that used legalism. The first emperor of China, who, the one who created all those terracotta soldiers, that huge tomb, he used legalism. And he said, my dynasty is going to last for 10,000 generations. It lasted for 3. And so, it collapsed very quickly, and it discredited legalism. He was very, effective in concentrating his powers, but it did not inspire respect in the people, for him. And so the subsequent dynasty that followed, the Qin Dynasty, the Han Dynasty, lasted for over 4 centuries, and promoted Confucianism and Confucianist ideas. But in looking at the kind of Confucianism, that was promoted, during that time, we'll see that it was very cleverly done, in the way that it was cloaked in Confucianist language. But in policies, they were actually quite legalist, in policies. So it was a blending of Confucianist ideas, legalist policies, mixed in with some Taoism, as well, that enabled the Han really to last, for such a long time. And because of the promotion, of his disciples, Confucius, posthumously, gained fame, and the Han claimed him as an ancestor. Claiming that they're descendants, of Confucius, to give themselves much more legitimacy, that moral legitimacy. All the dynasties, came into power because, of military might, because they were the most powerful group. But they all had to claim a moral legitimacy that, they are the gentlemen. They are the rulers who have, this, the perfection of the rituals, to have that, legitimate standing, to be the ruler of China. And Confucius then came to be constructed as a, he was, attributed with, writing these, several volumes of histories. He was elevated to the position, of a king, in some of the legends. He became a diviner. He had somehow, according to myths that were created, predicted the coming of the Han Dynasty. So there were all these, different stories, myths, legends that were created that elevated him, to the position, of an uncrowned king. And the cult of Confucius then gradually, expanded, and became even more elevated by the medieval periods when the cult of Confucius was incorporated into the imperial pantheon. Of deities that were worshipped by the emperors. So here you have Confucius being worshipped alongside, some of the legendary, emperors, legendary ministers, and he, becomes part of that, religious landscape, as well. And, he also comes to really represent, the key for success in civil service, because now all the educated elite had to study the so-called Confucianist classics. The Analects, of course, but there were also other classics that were attributed to Confucius. There were commentaries on these classics that, the educated elite had to study in order to pass the civil service examinations. And the civil service exam was a system that evolved from the Han Dynasty, in rudimentary forms, become systematized in the medieval period and also, early modern times, to really become the way through which people can gain access to the civil service. And so the civil service exam, looms large, in the lives of all the elite. Now, technically and theoretically, it was open to all people. If you can study, you can sit for the exams, and you can become an official, and you would gain fame, power, and wealth. But in reality, of course, to be able to do that, you had to have money, to hire tutors, to buy books. You had to have the time to study. So if you were constantly working the fields, you didn't have time to study. So it remained pretty much limited to a small elite, in Chinese society. And you have this educated elite that was dedicated to the Confucianist classics. And Confucius himself becomes the legendary sage that people all look to, for these educated elite.
I would say, wouldn't you also say that in order to keep your family's social prestige, you would also have to make sure that someone was sitting for the tests in order to keep your family on the cutting edge, and so that, that if there hadn't been a couple of generations before anybody had been in there, you wouldn't be among the top elites. So you'd have to keep making sure that someone from your family was going in.
And so you want to, and that's why there's a lot of pressure, on the young men, in these families. And so some families, who could not afford, to send their sons to schools, they would turn to their clans. And so the clans very often will provide the funding if there's a very precocious child. And, the clan will pool their money together to enable him to study and, go through the civil service exam. So here is, again, the importance of the family. So what we see is that through the centuries, you have Confucius gradually from the Han Dynasty onwards, all the way through to, the medieval and the early modern periods, becomes that, that figure that all educated elite look to. They have to study, and education then becomes one of the key, ways of success, for the elite. Now, you ask, what about the peasants? Did they study Confucianism? Well, I don't think they were really worried about morality, if they were worried about putting food on the table. And very often they would worship, they might worship Confucius also. They would hope that their sons, would be able to become a civil servant. But there were also, the religious landscape is very diverse. They can worship many different gods, goddesses. You have legendary, sages, physicians, turning into gods. So it's a very fluid religious landscape. So I would say that Confucius and Confucianism was dominated mostly by the elite, during the early modern times. And the civil service exam did not end until 1905. So it went all the way through, to the 20th century. And Confucianism, with its many manifestations, becomes sort of the representation of Chinese culture. It's transmitted into other regions in East Asia. It's transmitted, to Japan, to Korea, to Vietnam. And with that, you have, that same reverence for the family, the same reverence, for education, and the same reverence for the idea, of a gentleman. Okay. But that was also, that issue, that came to plague China. So we're going to skip ahead, and if we move on to the 19th and the 20th centuries, what was happening at that time around the world?
Wars.
Conflicts, imperialism, colonization. And there was the famous Opium War in 1839, where the treaty and at the first of the series of unequal treaties were signed, and there was it caused tremendous turmoil. And initially, the Chinese elite responded, with certain confidence that Chinese culture will withstand this challenge. It's just the technology that we're lacking. We'll just adopt the technology and we'll be fine. And then they were defeated again and again. And doubts began, to surface with the elite. And with the defeat of China, in the Sino-Japanese War, 1894, it became much more urgent. Now we're defeated not just by the West, we're defeated by Japan. And that is critical. Japan has always been the younger brother. How can the younger brother defeat the older brother? And so, more soul searching, more, efforts to try to save China, from Western imperialism, but also, a reevaluation of what Chinese culture is and Chinese civilization. Was it Chinese culture, the so-called feudal traditions that was holding China back, that made China so backwards, unable to resist, the challenges coming from the West? So you have a whole series of new intellectuals who emerged, who said that we need to really look into ourselves, to try to, save China. So Chen Duxiu was one of the intellectuals who was also the founder of the Chinese Communist Party as well. And the second group had Chen Duxiu's, readings. So what did, Chen Duxiu see as the main problems of Confucianism? Because here you have new intellectuals looking back in China, in Chinese culture, and saying, this is bad.
It's feudal. It was meant for feudal times, not modern times.
Mm-hmm. And what did he see as sort of the representation of modernity?
Individualism.
Individualism. And remember, Confucius talked about family, talked about your relationship with your mother, your father, and the paramount importance of the family. And Chen Dushou is arguing that, well, Chinese only know about family, know about the state, the community, but not the individuals. Okay? And so he sees that as one of the main problems, that Chinese lacking in individualism, cannot think for themselves, really. And what other things did he see as problematic?
Most of his examples talk about the oppression of women.
Women, okay.
That wives subject to their husbands to the point where if they become widows, they cannot remarry. That both families pressure the widow to keep her widowhood status, and that she then becomes kind of the responsibility of a son to take care of, and at no time can she assert herself.
Assert her own independence. And here he is actually romanticizing, the Western tradition, the position of women in the West. And he's using that to really criticize, Chinese culture. That patriarchy, that emphasis on the, position, of the father within the family, he's challenging that, and he sees that as part of that feudal tradition, part of that Confucianist idea that is really holding China back, being able to respond effectively to, the challenges of the West. So he says that, well, it's in the West, it's not considered improper even for strangers to sit or dance together. In the way of Confucian teaching, however, men and women do not sit on the same mat. So, he's saying that, well, we're just, we need to get rid of all of that. We need to get rid of Confucianism in order, to, be able to save China. So he says, Confucius lived in the feudal age. The ethics he promoted is the ethics of the feudal age. The social mores he taught, and even his own mode of living, were teachings and the modes of a feudal age. So need to get rid of that in order, to save China. Okay. So this was basically in the 1920s, when you have this massive soul searching, the so-called May 4th movement, that convulsed China, in the 1920s, and that was when also. The Communist Party was established in 1921, and gradually gained momentum. But Confucianism could also be used to impose more restrictions on the people as well, to be used to control the people. So you have the third reading that we have is on the New Life movement of Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalist leader at the time, who, is espousing these ancient virtues. So he's really going the opposite of Chen Dushou, right? So for the New Life movement, what was he espousing?
Going back to an older structure and giving it a modern interpretation to try to make in mind a utopia for the Chinese people, and particularly to oppose communists, the inroads of communism. I like the particular, he says he realized that military occupation of recovered territory was not enough, that it must be followed up by social and economic reconstruction in the divested areas. And of course I thought about Vietnam and what the U.S. was doing there.
And so, he understood that although in the 1930s, you have the nationalist government, being established, the communists were driven, to the countryside, but he still saw them as a tremendous threat, and he wants to bring back, traditional culture in order to impose a kind of uniformity, a kind of control on the people. And so, he's, going back to the classics, talking about all these, 4 virtues that you have to, learn, and embody. But if you look at, the behavior that is required in 16.4, New Life in Brief, it's very totalitarian. Do you see any Confucian ideas, in these behavior codes? Clothing should be tidy and clean. Buttons should be well buttoned. Hats should be worn straight. Shoes should be worn correctly. Food should be eaten in an orderly manner. Sit upright. Do not throw food on the ground. Bowls and chopsticks should be set in order.
And the actual quote here on the second page would be filial to your parents and love your brothers and sisters. So direct hearkening back.
Hearkening back to Confucianism. So what is he trying to do?
To me, it sounds like he's trying just to put public virtue first, like the virtue of society can be free. Because it kind of like, when I was reading part of this, it reminded me of like Christianity and Judaism and the Ten Commandments and like Leviticus. Like, we want to maintain these rules so that we can maintain a virtuous society so that we can be free. It's kind of how I was trying to draw some parallels with Western civilization.
And he's really trying to, he has political control over most of the country. Now he wants ideological control over, the population. Now, Confucius never said that people need to sit up straight, and it's the moral values that he's more interested in. And here it's the, for Chiang Kai-shek, the behavior, obedience to him, that was more important, which Confucius probably would find troubling. Because it's not obedience to, this particular, just a ruler. It's a moral ruler. It's a gentleman ruler.
And Madam Cheng, in the first part, makes it clear that, fascism is happening in Italy, Nazism is happening in Germany, so we need something in China, and new life is taking that place. And so my question for you is, did she write this in English for an American audience?
Not necessarily just for an American audience.
But she wrote it in English.
But she wrote it, I believe, yes. She was educated in the United States, so I believe she did write this, in English. Because
what jumped out at me is at the end of her prose, she quotes the letter from the missionary, from a Christian missionary, talking about how effective this is. And as I'm going through the rules, those are the same rules that you see today in conservative Christian schools in their behavior expectations for their students. Your hair must be cut in a certain way. You must wear your clothes in a certain way. And yeah, when you cross those lines, we hand out demerits and things like that.
Okay. Yeah, she was really a great asset to Chiang Kai-shek because she was educated in the United States, and she could communicate, for him with the foreign powers and present a sort of a more cosmopolitan face of the nationalist government. Okay? So, here you have then, 1920s attacks on Confucianism, 1930s, there are still people who rejected Confucianism, but the government is trying to use Confucianism as a form of control. Now, 1949, the nationalists are driven out, of China. The People's Republic, is established, communist rule, and we see, again, changes. And Confucianism, again, undergoes this low and high, in the People's Republic. Mao was very much concerned about the elite, the dominance of the intellectuals, and he did not trust the intellectuals. So, as he made several mistakes in the 1950s, leading to massive famine within the country, he was criticized. And he decided, in order to come back, he was going to launch the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, where he attacked the establishment, the Communist Party. He attacked imperialism. He attacked bourgeois society. He attacked feudalism. And so in that, poster on the left, crush the old world, create a new world. And down below, you have, the cross that represents Western imperialism. You have, the record players representing bourgeois society, and you have a book that represents the Confucianist, ideas. So you have 1970s, the 1960s through the 1970s. tremendous attack on Confucianism, on Confucianist, ideas. Statues were knocked down. Confucius temples, were destroyed. Classics were burned. If you had any old books, at home, and the Red Guards came and saw that, you would be hauled out for criticism, and they would build a bonfire and burn everything. So that was the phase of, attack on, Confucianism during this time. But jump ahead to today. What's, Confucius, to the Chinese government and to the Chinese people today?
Like harmony.
Harmony. Okay. And again, beginning in the late 1980s, you again see sort of an elevation of Confucius and Confucianism. So we have Xi Jinping here, how to read Confucius, promoting Confucianism. Why is that? What happened? There's this whiplash going on.
It didn't work. That didn't work, so let's try this.
So communism didn't work. It didn't do what it promised to do. So they're looking for something else to hold society together.
So going back,
capitalism is resulting in an atomization, individualism.
Individualism that Chen Dushou actually was advocating, but it's challenging to the Communist Party because you don't want people to go their own separate ways. They have to, go towards and work towards the socialist stream, for China. So, as China emerges, as a global player, the leaders are looking back to Chinese tradition and Chinese culture, as a way to bring, more coherence to the culture. As people scatter, trying to pursue profits, and, pursue their own, capitalist streams, here the Communist Party is imposing a kind of ideology, saying that, we need harmony, we need, obedience, we need filial piety. So it's actually against the law to abandon your parents, in China. And it's also, directed globally, as a way to ensure, a kind of not, this strong political power that, China wants to exert, but a kind of soft power. So spread of Chinese civilization, the elevation of the idea that, Chinese civilization is 5,000 years old and can contribute, globally to everyone. To the happiness, of everyone. So you have Confucius institutes in, all, at least several hundred of them, in all continents, in Africa, in South Asia, in Australia, in Americas, Confucius institutes are used really as a kind of soft power here. So in looking at, sort of the very quick look at the history of Confucius and Confucianism, we see that, it's never really static, and it's always, fits into a particular, mode and particular needs, of the time. So is there a real Confucius? What's the real Confucius? A real Confucianism?
It's kind of age specific. I mean, it becomes what's needed for the time in a lot of ways. So like today's Confucianism is not necessarily the feudal Confucianism ideas, although it's based on some of it, but it's what they need today.
Okay, but are there, elements of Confucianism that you can say that, Confucius, looking at society, contemporary society, would agree with? Or is he just going to be completely, disenchanted?
I mean, if I understand his teachings correctly, his focus is on relationships, right? This idea of the way for Confucius is how you get along with other people. Like he rejects this idea of individuality. What's the point of being an individual if you don't have someone to share it with? And that, whether Xi Jinping is presenting himself as like the elder brother, there to help his younger brothers. But that's about that relationship with other countries or relationship within the family of nations and peoples and things like that. And I imagine at least that Confucius and Mencius both would say, yeah, and but then also probably have a few things to say about the way he was doing things.
The way that he's doing it, the way that he's, especially in terms of, for example, treating the ethnic minorities, within the country, and in his insistence on, laws when it is to his advantage. Yeah. So I think Confucius would find that troubling. Okay. So, so this is kind of, a very broad, look at how, one idea, one philosopher can be interpreted and used differently, throughout history.